Can everybody say, is my screen visible? Allison, can you confirm?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Harika. Welcome in. Okay, so yeah, congratulations on your admission, and you are on your way to a ride. It's got many ups and downs, but at the end of it, I think it'll all turn out to be spectacularly good and one of the better experiences that you will have in your lifetime. So my name is Anoop. I'm a research faculty in the Department of Pediatrics at University of Chicago Medicine, and I'm also a lecturer in the Masters in Biomedical Informatics program. I've been with University of Chicago for about 4 years now, 5 years now, and with Graham School, the BMI program for about 4 years. I teach two courses. One is called the Intermediate Data Analysis, and the second one is called Machine Learning for Biomedical Informatics. Now, the prerequisite for intermediate data analysis is concepts in programming. So typically it's like a 3-course sequence that you will be taking if you so choose to do so. Incoming students in fall would take concepts in programming in fall, followed by intermediate data analysis in winter, and then machine learning for biomedical informatics in spring. And consequently, if you're a spring admit, then you have spring, summer, and fall as your quarters in which you take these courses. They build upon each other, which is why they ordered in a sequence. Concepts in programming is for people who have little to no background in programming. And there you'll start by Jason Ellison, who's a great teacher. He'll cover concepts such as coding skills, what is a function, what is a variable, and things like that. And that's done in Python. That's a prerequisite for intermediate data analysis, thinking being that once you get familiar with the concepts in programming, you can switch out a language. In fact, what happens in intermediate data analysis is that you switch over from Python to R, and you start coding in R right from the get-go. All your assignments, all your class projects will be done in R in intermediate data analysis. And now, intermediate data analysis is a kind of a broad topic, but it basically covers any or more of the mainstream statistical modeling, as well as a little bit of introduction to predictions in the course. People who do want to dive into prediction a little bit more or a lot more, they go up and take machine learning for biomedical informatics. And then those two courses are what I teach up. So I'm responsible for the technical and the math and the stats part of the course. I want to emphasize that this is just one stream of the program. There's plenty of other courses in the part of the program that deals with population health, leadership skills, big data analysis, and so on, and even qualitative stuff if you so choose to incline. If you incline to go down that path, that's totally fine. You get to choose what your track is going to be. And as Diana mentioned, it's clearly a reflection of two things. One, what you like to do and where you see headed in your career. So I'll go through this lecture. And when somebody asked me to come up with this mini lecture for this purpose, I had a hard time figuring out what to do. So when I was my first informatics job, I was part of a big national lab, and the guy who ran it, he was very big in his field. He was a biological scientist, and he had this 100-person group, which is a big deal. And he was national as well as international. So he had always saying that for his grants and for his proposals, he would always describe the last experiment first, which basically means he would show where the science is going as an endpoint and sort of take you through what you need to do to get there. And so with that in respect, I'm going to talk about the last lecture in machine learning, which is literally the last lecture that you will take before you graduate and step out of the program. Okay, so that'll hopefully and tweak things such a way that, to show you the journey till you get that point. So we're going to be talking today about deep learning in healthcare. And the agenda is very simple. I'm going to talk about what is deep learning, what it does in healthcare, and I'm going to give you one example of how to do it with the data that you probably work with. So before we talk about deep learning, we have to start way back and talk about machine learning, which is which most of you might know, but it's basically a technique where you get to train models to predict outcomes. That's simple what it is. So my research is on developing models that predict outcome in hospitalized kids. So whenever a kid gets to a hospital, all my models start working and they predict who's at risk for infection, who's at risk for going to the ICU, who's at risk for mortality and things like that. Artificial neural networks is a particular class of machine learning models, and the structure looks somewhat like this. You have these bunch of neurons, which is sort of how the layout is in an intelligent thinking brain, and they're arranged into layers, and you have typically an input layer and hidden layer and output layer. And as you can see, the number of neurons is pretty countable, at least, if not small. And the input features go into the neural network, and the neural network just learns these patterns in it that will tell you, yeah, this patient has this likelihood of cardiac disease, this patient is at risk for diabetes, and so on and so forth. What deep learning does is it takes that hidden layer in between and just blows it up. It's basically a type of artificial neural network, in which case the number of neurons just go from 40 neurons to several 100,000 neurons, or even half a million neurons. And the idea is to blow up the space so that you can learn these patterns more effectively. So in order to understand why this works, here's an example. At the baseline, at the bottom, what deep learning does, it captures information both locally and globally. In other words, it captures local patterns, and then it captures global patterns, and then it puts those two together. So if you give a deep learning model a picture of a cat, all the first sort of big bunch of layers, all that they see is just a bunch of squiggly lines, nothing else. They just learn, here's a squiggly line, here's a triangle, here's what a V shape looks like inverted, and things like that. The later layers start putting those together and start making these global information together. That's where the global patterns come into play, where a bunch of squiggly lines make up the eye, a bunch of squiggly lines make up the ear of the cat or the nose of the cat. Finally, the model is able to predict the word cat associated with a picture of a cat. That's essentially what a deep layer at the basic principle of how it learns these patterns. And deep learning is everywhere. I mean everywhere, from your Netflix queues to Google Photos to self-driving cars, right? So it's so dominant in the field outside of healthcare that it's just a matter of time before it getting established in healthcare. And we already see evidence of that effect. In early 2018, this first sort of deep learning papers started coming out. These are two papers that came out in JAMA, which is it's a very famous top-tier medical journal. And they basically dealt with diagnosing diabetic retinopathy from retinal images. So given an image, a bunch of images, these models were able to say this image corresponds to this disease versus this image does not correspond to that disease. And slowly, people started noticing a couple of things. One, that deep learning does better than humans. So here's an example. Here's a study where they were asked to diagnose breast cancer from images. And the top three models had what is called an AUC of 0.994. Now, AUC is a term that I'm just going to throw out there. And basically, one means you're predicting everything so perfectly. So as you can see, it gets pretty close to one, right? If you look at what the humans were doing, they're way down there at 80%, at AUC of 80%. Compare that with what a machine is doing, you understand why the attraction and why the hype is sort of real and why this is likely to stay. With that in mind, so you have a structure of what is deep learning, and you have an idea why this is so prevalent. Here's an example of deep learning, right? So this is some work that I did in my research a year ago. It got published last year, and I want to take you guys through the thinking as well as the mechanics of it. So deep learning is really good for image data, that is basically pictures, as well as data that is in sequence, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So image data is basically pictures. Most of the deep learning came from algorithms that predict cats versus dogs. In fact, that was the most popular deep learning task, and that simple competition of which picture is a cat versus which picture is a dog drove deep learning, the theory as well as the implementation of it by leaps and bounds. Data as a sequence is basically where you have observations or readings that are in sequence, right? So for example, a perfect example of this is longitudinal data. The data that I work with is time-based data. Whenever a kid gets admitted to the hospital, they start getting recordings of temperature, and they started getting that in sequence, right? So at 8 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m., and so on and so forth. That is what is called longitudinal data. And data that is sequencing, deep learning can really grab onto that trends and then try learn patterns in that trends. The other sort of data is clinical text, where NLP comes into play, where natural language processing comes into play, and you can see that words such as this class is awesome is because they are arranged in a particular format and not in a randomized manner. So any sort of data that's a sequence and any sort of data that's two-dimensional, such as images, deep learning are really, really good. Now, I mentioned these data that I work with, they're longitudinal, right? But they're not really image data. They are fine longitudinal, that's great. But they're not in an image format. They're discrete, they're nice tables, and they're arranged by time, and everything is nice and clean. So the question was, can we take data that is inherently discrete, make it into an image, so that we can use deep learning to predict outcomes, right? So here's our objective. We wanted to develop a framework that basically took patients' data, clinical data, throughout a period of their stay, turn it into a picture, and then use deep learning to predict outcome. In this case, it's mortality that we're trying to predict. That is whether or not the patient would die in the hospital. So what do we do for our data? We took data from adults who came into the University of Chicago Medicine over an 8-year period from 2008 to 2016. We took data from the first 48 hours of admission. So the moment that they walked in, 48 hours, we took that entire electronic health record data. And then we turned that into a picture. And the primary outcome was mortality after the 48 hours. So anytime they could have died after the 40, they could have died in, after the first 2 days, they could have died in day 3, they could have died in 2 weeks from them, they could have died a month from that first 2 period. This model would be able to predict it. And so that was a theory, that was a hypothesis. So we went about trying to derive the system. So the question is, how do we get this to look like a picture, right? So remember what I said about how pictures are essentially two-dimensional representations of data. So we have used that approach. We took time and put it on the x-axis. We took all variables and stacked them on the y-axis. So all the vital sign variables, such as your heart rate, temperature, your systolic and diastolic blood pressures, all those readings go there. All the laboratory results that are addressed for a particular patient, whether or not you have an infection, all that go there. All the medications that you are get clumped up together. Interventions, most important, basically scores that are given to you, they are assigned to you by a nurse. Any sort of diagnostic examinations or tests, who you are, your age, your gender, your race, your ethnicity, how long have you been sick for, or do you have any underlying heart condition, all that goes up top, and time goes on the very bottom, top. So if you take each of these variables and you sort of normalize them to a 0 to 1 scale, where 0 is black being the minimum, 1 is white, which is the maximum, then you end up looking like a picture like this. And if you take this, what we call as a snapshot of somebody who died in the hospital versus somebody who actually survived in the hospital and got discharged, you notice a couple of things. So on the left is somebody who got discharged live from the hospital. And on the right is somebody who had died in the hospital. So you notice a couple of things. First, you notice that the vital sign region for the patient who died in the hospital on the right side is a little choppy, right? You see a lot more gradations in terms of gray and white, and as opposed to the person on the left, they had constant vital signs that were not fluctuating. And this is because for sick patients, things jump up and down. And so that is understandable. So we do see some sort of an effect here. The second thing that you would notice is that the area of interventions and medications is pretty much blank in somebody who is discharged alive. Whereas somebody who died in hospital, they come in sick, doctors don't really know what's going on, so they order a battery of tests, they start treatment on a bunch of things. and then wait for the laboratory results to come in to confirm things, right? So during that 48-hour period, there's this period of diagnosis that's using a bunch of interventions and medications. So you see actual light, that area of the image sort of lighting up corresponding to activity that involved in the treatment of the patient. So we have a signal here. So, okay, we made a picture. We see some sort of an effect. So the question was, okay, can we learn from it? So here's what we did. We took the EHR data, we converted them into pictures. We split them into 70% what is called the derivation cohort and 30% which is the validation cohort. Among the derivation, we put it into a deep learning model that combines both the image part as well as the sequence part. So the CNN is a deep learning model that learns from images. The LSTM is a deep learning model that learns from time. So we put those two together and created a new model, and then we just learned it on this data. And then we compared it to metrics in the field. So these are two metrics called Muse and SOFA, which are basically that scoring systems that current hospitals use to allocate risk. So if you are a 7 on a SOFA scale, you are more likely to deteriorate in the future as opposed to if you're a 4 on the SOFA scale. We'll talk about GradCam there on the right side in a little bit. So this is what is called as a table 1, where you're comparing patients who died, which is basically patients with the outcome, with patients without the outcome. And this is an integral part of all data analysis. And you'll start learning about this in intro data analysis, you'll start learning about this intermediate data analysis, and the rest of your life, any sort of data science project that you do, the first thing that you will want to do is create this table, okay? And here's our performance model. So you don't worry about the ones in between. The one that you really care about is the industry stuff. It's pretty bad in terms of predicting who's going to die. Whereas the R model does a really good job of predicting who's going to die post 48 hours. And like I said, this could be anybody who died within 2 weeks or a month or the next day. The last part of this talk is about where does our deep network focus the most. And that's really another crucial part. And that's what distinguishes our machine learning from everybody else. Because in healthcare, we really care about trusting the model. In order for people to turn on a model, they have to know what's going on inside the model. Only then will they be able to trust the model. And a whole lot of syllabus materials, time is spent on this one topic of trying to interpret your model and trying to see what's going on inside your model. So here's what's going on inside this model. On the right-hand side is sort of activity. So the red means the deep learning, this particular area was important for this particular patient. So as you can see, the interventions and this testing is lit up again, a little bit of vital sign, whereas the activity, the labs wasn't important for predicting mortality in this patient. So to conclude, the main sort of takeaways are we illustrate how we can convert into pictures, we have a developer model, and we can predict a wide variety of outcomes. But for you guys, the key takeaway is that you want to understand deep learning is increasingly prevalent in healthcare. You want to see how, you have data, you can do innovative things such as taking data and then convert it into pictures to fit your model. And I hope I emphasize the importance of interpreting a model as opposed to just taking a model and then going at it and seeing what happens, right? Our field is a lot more intuitive and interpretative, and there is a lot to think about when you're building the model, what features going in the model, and if the model is actually working. So with that, I'll stop, and if there's any questions, please feel free to ask me or the alumni students.
Is it funny that I ask a question?
No,
the death was like before discharge, correct?
Correct.
I should know this. Okay, I was clarifying.
Yeah, death was before. Yes, correct. This was in hospital death. What were the major challenges you encountered during the study? Honestly, it was the interpretative part, because we really wanted to make the case to physicians and to trust the model, and that takes standard models a lot further, right? Predicting which movie you like best is great, but which movie you should see next is great. But you want to think about why that's the case, and that is the challenge here in this particular case. You got about 30 seconds to ask a question, so type really fast. Okay, if nothing else, we can just click on return to the main session, and I'll see you guys over there. And I really look forward to seeing each of you in fall and interacting with you and taking this journey with you. Bye.